Hi, I see that we have folks who are starting to join the webinar this afternoon. I just want to welcome you and let you know that just hold tight. We're going to give it another minute or two for more folks to join, and we'll be starting the webinar in just a minute or two. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute. I'm just going to give it about 30 more seconds for folks to join. All right. Well, welcome again, everyone. I'm Sarah Bodor. I'm the Director of Affiliate Relations and Advocacy for NAAEE. We're really excited to have you all here on this special webinar with us this afternoon. I'm just going to talk for a few more seconds here and then turn it over to our network experts. But as you all know from the email you received, we are really pleased to bring to you a series of 3 webinars focused on cultivating effective networks. We're spacing them out roughly a month apart. Today is session 1, Cultivating a Network Mindset. We will be fortunate enough to have our 2 guest panelists here join us for the affiliate workshop at the NAAEE conference in Spokane, Washington next month. And hopefully you're all planning on being in attendance at that session. And then we'll be following up that workshop with 2 more sessions focused on this work of cultivating effective networks. And we really hope that there's sort of a twofold benefit to this work. We are all obviously engaged with one another in a network of affiliate organizations and EE associations throughout North America. But you all also are leaders within your own networks at the state and regional levels. And so hopefully over the course of the next 3 months, this will give us an opportunity to think about how we can work more effectively with one another, but also how back in your home, you can help to be a transformative leader at the network level at whichever scale you're operating. I think I mentioned in the email that I sent out that at NAAEE, some of the staff here have been fortunate enough to be working with Odin and ARI on our own network functionality and how we can be stronger network participants. I think you're all going to really enjoy the conversation that we're going to have here today. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ari, who's going to share her screen, and she and her colleague Odin are going to begin this work with us. So thank you so much for being here, Ari and Odin.
Hi, I think Odin's going to share his screen.
Great.
Thanks, Sarah. Excited to be with everyone here. So,
yeah, I think I'm just going to do a quick introduction of ourselves and then ask people to put their own introductions into the chat. My name's Ari. Today I'm talking to you from Portland, but normally I live in Mexico City. And I work with networks specifically around communication strategy, sometimes around equity and power, and around network visualization. And today, I'm co-presenting today with Odin from Berkeley, California.
Hi, everyone. It's Odin Zachman. Ari and I collaborate in a project called Network Ecology. We work with other folks and work with networks around the world of different sizes to help folks collaborate more effectively. And we're excited to talk with you today about cultivating a network mindset. So we know we've spoken to a few of you as part of our research into how you view networks through NAAEE, and just excited for our time together today.
And so by way of introduction, we were just going to ask to type into the chat your name, email address, just in case anybody wants to follow up with you, and your affiliation, as well as your answer to the question, how have the connections you've made in your life and work supported you? And hopefully I'll type that into the chat. And are we able to hear audio from anyone in the attendees? I've never done the webinar format in Zoom before. Maybe not. Okay, great. Okay, thanks, Ashley, for typing into the chat.
Oops.
And then Odin, do you want to take us into the agenda review, the series,
Sure.
and then agreements and expectation?
Sure.
I also really, go ahead.
Yeah. So essentially, what we're doing today is providing a basic overview in terms of how we see networks, and what we're going to do, and we'll engage you sort of via the chat throughout this time, but we're in the kind of intro piece right now, and we're going to talk about what the arc of this series looks like, which will include our session on October 10th in Spokane. And we really wanted to create some building blocks here to talk essentially about network mindsets today. In Spokane, we're going to talk more about structures and shared leadership, and then we're going to follow that up with a couple of other webinars which focus on how you might move forward together in your work to build on the great connections you already have and to deepen that. And the idea here is not only that you get to learn from us and from each other, but that it'll be in Spokane and on the follow-up webinars an incredibly interactive experience where you're able to apply what you're learning to the work that you're doing so that you can leverage the power of your network even more deeply. So we're going to go through today. We'll talk a lot about network mindsets and practices. We'll have you reflect a little bit about kind of how those apply to your current work, how you see those showing up, and then how you can also pull together sort of more, kind of a deeper opportunity to work together across the NAAEE network and what that looks like from your vantage point.
And then, Odin, I think we wanted to go into agreements and expectations for the session.
Yeah. So if in the chat, one of the things that we want to do whenever we do work with networks, we wanted to model it here, is to think about what are the agreements and expectations you have for our time together, and that could be today in our learning with all of you, and it could be over time through this series and just in your work as a network. So if you could enter into the chat box some of the expectations that you have of either our learning today or this series, and then any agreements that you already have in place or that you think are important for supporting networks and connection across different individuals and institutions, that would be great. Great, so you can just enter those in. Appreciate everybody's introductions. Any expectations people want to share or agreements that help frame this work? Great. Okay, so feel free to fill in any other expectations you have or agreements you'd like to put out there. Thanks, Katie. Learning more about best practices and how they change based on the scale of the network. New perspectives on networks. Thanks, Kiki. That can be applied to various organizations. Great success stories. Thanks, Sarah A and Sarah B. Yeah, we'll try to, Sarah B, we'll try to get into thinking transformationally even today and what that looks like. Ashley, thanks. Scaling up. Great. These are fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, that's Linda, you're asking the golden question there. How do you do this in a way that's not time consuming? We'll definitely talk about that a little bit over the course of this series. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. So, Ari, I think I'll turn it back over to you, and we'll kind of jump in here to the kind of framing network mindsets.
Okay. I'm gonna wait till you get to the slide. So I wanted to start out very broadly. Odin, I'm wondering if you could go to slide 5.
Mm-hmm.
Very broadly, very kind of metaphorically, to get us thinking in ways that we're not normally thinking of. In other words, to sort of break out of our pattern thinking. And I want to use 3 metaphors from nature to help us open that kind of vision. And while I'm talking about this, it might be useful to hold a couple questions, which is how does this kind of like network level thinking contrast with an organizational type of thinking? And secondly, like how might it open up possibilities for our work? And if Odin, if you could go to the first slide about mushrooms. So, and you might have to mute the sound on the video. I'm not sure how it'll play out. But so for the first metaphor, I wanted to think about mushrooms, and these are oyster mushrooms in particular, to sort of call out that the visible part of the mushroom, the part that we see above ground, is really a small portion, and it's connected to this massive underground network. So you're not actually seeing the underlying work and parts that are going into building the network. However, those occasionally emerge to bear fruit, and then those fruits return back to nurture the underground parts. So things like Arab Spring about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, or a little bit less, the Occupy movement, Black Lives Matter movement are representing these relatively short-lived events, but that are connected to deeper movements and networks. And I wanted to sort of start with that one because I think it is a metaphor that can sort of differentiate between campaigns, the visible and very action-oriented top level, and the underlying network of sort of ongoing relationships that might not be specifically geared at an action or a goal. And then within that, I also want to hold the individual level of what would a individual spore or an individual entity within that mushroom look like or feel like. I know I'm kind of reaching for this metaphor, but I think this the network science piece of the strength of weak ties. For example, if you're looking for a new job or something, often that opportunity comes up in your weak ties, not, for example, in your really present relationships that the people you talk with every day. So this might suggest a different opportunity to connect without a specific reason, but just living into the shared vision of the network. And the second metaphor I want to bring up around network dynamics is starling murmuration. So this video shows hundreds of thousands or thousands of starlings, birds that fly together in these different patterns, which is related to this idea of emergence within networks of like one individual bird might not necessarily know where they're all moving toward, but what emerges is these sort of like clouds or these other larger structures. And I think you can see this too in schools of fish that move like that can distract or challenge much larger predators. So I think thinking at the level of the individual bird, it's a different type of awareness. You have to really be aware of who's around you on every side, rather than just maybe looking forward or looking down to figure out where we're walking toward. In other words, having a really broad vision. And then the last metaphor I wanted to bring in is one of a butterfly going through transformation. I don't know if this is common knowledge either, but those caterpillars inside their cocoon are literally liquefy. They turn from one solid creature, go through liquid, and then become something completely different that can travel thousands of miles in their migration. So I wanted to sort of hold this as a very aspirational question of if we're thinking about transformation, like what are we willing to let go of to become something completely different? So given those questions and sort of high-level transformational thoughts about what we can learn from nature, I also want to be really grounded and bring in these network weaver practices and mindsets that Odin and I have developed. And so we'll switch to that. Next slide. And so to really be bringing in the individual and our practices and actions in these network settings. So Odin, I think I'll transition to you for practice number 1.
Great. Thanks, Ari. So one of the pieces, and I think this is really brought out by these metaphors that Ari just went through, is how we foster connections. So how we think about connections and how we foster connections, and really thinking ecologically around both being part of a larger system and then doing the work of creating those connections as well. And network practitioners connect not only people, but institutions, ideas, and resources, and it's all in service to mutual benefit. So it's really about looking at the broader vision of what it is that you're involved with and trying to bring in others' visions as well. And this is really the currency, if you will, or if water is sort of the lifeblood of any landscape, this is the water of networks. This is the sort of common bond in terms of building long-term relationships. And this can just be, connections with a couple of people and following up and building those relationships. It can also be understanding that something is happening maybe in one part of the country and a similar piece is happening in another part of the country, and you want to make sure that those pieces connect for that larger systemic mutual benefit.
And then the second practice for network weavers, network practitioners, is around cultivating collaborations. And that can be anything from sharing advice or challenges to long-term partnerships, writing grants together, working on projects together. And really the methodology is striving for a lot of diverse types of relationships, like I just mentioned. And that they might kind of ebb and flow throughout time. So it might start out as like, we just met at the conference, have a quick call about that, but that relationship could will hopefully evolve over time.
I think it's really critical in a network, and again, I think the metaphors that Ari started with really illustrate this in a palpable way, especially with all the connection that you have to cultivating ecological literacy and connection, is to remember abundance. Because networks aren't just about the role that you play, but about the greater impact and greater leverage that a perspective and a practice of abundance can have. So that there's this sense of feeling support and not constraint. There's a sense of feeling possibility rather than limitation. And you're thinking about different ways to maximize resources, that it's not just about an additive function, but it's really about kind of an exponential leveraging of what exists in terms of resources of all kinds, financial, intellectual, artistic, throughout the network. And this is just a little bit of a kind of comparison, because many of us, just because of the culture in which we're operating, tend to look at things, or can look at things, through a scarcity mindset. And we really want to bring the abundance lens here. So I won't read through all of these, but you can see the connection and the differences in terms of looking at something through a frame of abundance, and then what that inclination and approach might produce in terms of your success at creating a vibrant network.
And the next practice is around honoring difference. So every participant or member in a network brings all these diverse types of things that Oda mentioned: skills, resources, perspectives. Their context will be different. And networks are really strengthened by understanding and leveraging these differences. So that means that as somebody who is running a network or a part of a network, you really should be just trying to seek to understand these differences. And again, approaching them with an abundance mindset of how can we engage and then empower people to bring those differences to the work.
When we're operating in a network, and I think this is a great life skill generally, but particularly within a network, it's really important to be able to hold tensions of different kinds. So somebody who's skillful at navigating and creating strong networks really can call out those tensions and be able to share them in a productive way so that we can move through them more gracefully and create, thinking from that, abundance perspective, create opportunities that might come from places that traditionally have been seen as in conflict with each other. And to be able to do this, you want to think about complexity, the sort of inspiration that maybe you felt when you were watching those clips of the mushrooms or the starlings or the butterfly emerging from a chrysalis, and think about, well, how do we apply that sort of transformation that needs to happen and that level of complexity to the work that we're doing, and just see that the tensions are a part of that process.
And I think part of a very specific tension to hold is the tension between the individual and the whole. And so, for example, if you were a starling in that murmuration, and since we have brains a little bit more advanced than the starlings, or maybe different instead of advanced, how can you both see your part in that cloud, and how can we at the same time try and hold that that shape as it emerges and evolves over time? So I think thinking about the network as both rooted in place and very highly contextual, and also balancing that with the larger level scale, is an ongoing practice of holding the whole of the network. And there are tools that can help with this, like network visualizations and network maps that can help see dynamics of the network. Also, different kinds of systems maps can help see the whole at a different level than we might normally be occupying in the day-to-day work.
And then finally, a key network mindset and practice is the ability to broadcast and translate. So this focuses specifically on communication, both among members of the network and then beyond the network, and honoring practices like transparency, participation, accessibility in terms of different audiences, so that both across the network there's a sense of information being shared and that's supporting people's engagement, and that there's also a way in which the network creates not only an understanding of itself, but an understanding of the broader context in which it's operating, and then is able to share that with others and share what the sort of results are because of participation, much like you all reflected on in our introductions in terms of how your connections have supported you. The network itself is part of communicating that. And so, how are we clear about the ways we talk about the work that we do, the benefits that accrues, and then also how do we understand what we're not about, or who's missing, who should be there, and being able to have those discussions both internally and more broadly. So given all of that, I know we covered a lot in terms of the approaches and then these practices. Want to kind of put it back to you and see if there are questions that you have that are coming up at this point that we can talk through, and you can either post those in the chat, and there's also a Q&A feature that you can use to put a question in there, and then we'll be able to respond to that. And then after that, we're going to transition to thinking a little bit more about how you see your role and how you might start bringing some of these more transformative approaches and practices into your day-to-day. So any questions that folks have or just observations that are coming up? Yes. The question, Kiki, about the slides, absolutely. This is all recorded, and we're going to share the slides as well, and we have other resources. Yeah, great question. And we can just take these as they come. Maybe we'll have a couple, and then Ari and I can just kind of pick and address a couple of these, and we can keep going. And the nice thing about this series and about being together with so many of you in Spokane is that we're able to engage in a different way moving forward as well. Okay, so here are some questions coming up. Ari, do you have one that is kind of pulling your attention, or I can just jump in?
Well, I'm fascinated by Eileen's question of how do we get the starlings to see themselves as part of the larger group. And I think that's part of, I think that can come out in a lot of ways. For example, every time you communicate about the work or the group or network that you're a part of, to be forefronting both of those levels, right? So like we are part of something bigger. And I think, there's a lot of ways I'm thinking of like ways that I do that personally, where I'm like seeing myself as an individual, but also part of something else. I think that comes a lot out with different identities, right? Like I'm an individual, but I'm also from the United States, right? And that means something, and I'm very aware of that identity. So I don't know, I guess I tend to think of that in terms of communication practices and sort of around the identity of the network and the work. Odin, I don't know if you wanted to.
Well, I think it's also about creating a shared sense of purpose and a certain set. I mean, part of the agreements exercise from earlier is getting to ways in which we want to engage with one another, but it also starts getting at something deeper, which we'll explore as we move forward in this series, which is around values and role. And how do you want to show up in a way that actually expresses the values that you hold and that the larger group sees as important for cultivating in the world. So I think, part of that is to just help the starlings, in this case people, be more reflective around their own reasons for participation. And then I also think it's about that broader consciousness of the system, and to be able to ask really blunt questions like, if what we want to achieve is X, fill in the blank, then what are the ways we need to behave with one another and in the broader world that help us achieve that? And there are lots of activities that we do that get people to create a set of agreements where they're not just agreements on a page, but they're actually agreements that guide behaviors. They're agreements that change the way that people interact with each other, much in the same way as the starlings already have a set of agreements, and it's kind of beautiful and mysterious to us what those are. But we need to be explicit about, here's what we want to achieve, here's the vision, let's work on this together, and then let's actually figure out what the behaviors are that will support that. And in some cases we don't know, and a lot of network work is emergent and experimental. So we try things on for size and maybe they work and maybe they don't work. So there's not a formula per se, which is why we talk in the KG language of mindsets and practices. But I think it's really important to have folks reflect on what their role is and how their contribution is not just individual. I'm also interested in these questions around scarcity and abundance, and we've had lots of conversations already with some folks at NAAEE about this issue of capacity. And I know I actually used to be my sort of first career, which I still feel like I do a little bit, but I was an environmental educator and a community educator, and so I'm familiar with the kinds of work that you all are doing, and also the nature of not only your field, but lots of fields where we're trying to do some pretty big work in changing hearts and minds. And oftentimes we don't get the resources that we need. And so I think the first place that we tend to think about, this sort of sense of how do we shift from scarcity to abundance is around just resources themselves and being able to share that more. And that only comes from trying to create a connection, no matter how challenging it may be and how full your day is. Again, as we mentioned earlier, this sort of common bond or the water or the currency of networks is relationship building. So I think, overcoming that mindset of scarcity is in some ways the antidote is connection. And even if somebody else is wrestling with scarcity as well, I've found that there's a certain sense of possibility and abundance that can emerge from simply reaching out to someone and talking about the challenge. And then maybe you're still in the challenge or the scarcity mindset, but there's a dedication to saying, well, let's not dwell here, let's move out of that. And I think thinking about different options and realizing that there's not just one way of doing things, even if it's the way you've been doing it for a while. I think the sense of creativity and wonder that many of you and the folks you work with try to instill in children and adults about the natural world and our connection to it is a natural source, especially given what you're doing. It's a natural source for kind of connecting to that, moving away from scarcity and realizing that the world we're talking about, while it may be under siege, is fundamentally abundant and about creating abundance. And so how do we do that in our organizations and in our lives as well? Any other reflections on the scarcity abundance issue or other questions that you have? If you want to post questions or reflections or follow-ups in the chat or in the Q&A box. Okay. So maybe we'll move on. I'll reshare my screen here. And we wanted to invite some questions from you, but we have further questions for you as well in this next part of our time together. Harry, did you want to take folks through this, or you want me to?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if you were holding space for more questions in the chat, but so I think, I kind of want to throw that question back to Eileen and see what you're thinking about, like, how are you seeing your role, and how do you all see your role as individuals, but also considering your part in the broader ecosystem, and however you define that ecosystem, right? It could be your individual network or at a state level, for example, right? Like, I'm interested to hear how you hold that balance in your work. And then the second question is sort of like, how could we think more like oyster mushrooms or monarch butterflies and bring those transformative aspects into the day-to-day? And specifically, how might this shift your interactions with others who are doing the similar work?
So you can enter those into the chat, and we didn't plan this. This is not necessarily the magic of networks, but in some ways, the two questions that we had for you, very much as Ari was pointing to, kind of mirror your questions for us. And I also want to say, and this is a challenging piece, but I think it's connected to fostering connections and creating abundance, is that we firmly believe, and this is coming out of a learner-centered approach and a network approach and a community-driven approach, that the answers are not necessarily in the realm of expertise. So to be perfectly transparent, you heard Ari say earlier, like, well, I've never done, sort of like the webinar format on Zoom. I mean, a lot of what we do is kind of conversational, and we wanted to set up these foundational aspects for you this time. But in our future webinars and in the session, of course, in Spokane, it's very interactive because it's sometimes realizing that the answers are already there. And so we would love for you to reflect on these questions in terms of, your role, kind of to Eileen's Starling question. And then I think both Sarah A and Sarah B asked questions about scarcity and abundance. And in some ways, it's like bringing those transformative aspects that we talked about, either the broader framing or the practices, might inspire ways that your interactions shift. So any reactions to that? Feedback to those questions, or more questions on those questions? Mm-hmm. Thanks, Eileen. And Jean. Yeah. Kiki, thanks for that reflection. It's amazing amongst the starlings that there aren't more collisions that happen. Yeah. And I think sometimes, and Eileen, I'll reflect on what you shared, and Jean, sorry, I don't know if it's Jean or Jeannie. I apologize if I'm getting your name wrong, but I think, this whole idea of reaching out to other stakeholders, oftentimes we're really connected in the EE world, but there's also a tendency in any field to keep working with the people you're already working with. And, Ari talked earlier about the value of the weak ties, and you get a job not because of the people you know, but in some ways the sort of acquaintances or the, kind of one level or two levels out. And often what we encourage in building networks is the real, it's like they say in ecosystems, like the most generative part of the biome is at the edges, where forest meets field, or where the ocean meets the shore, or, different levels of any particular ecosystem. So it's the same thing with networks. It's like, where are you looking to the periphery? And in these stakeholder questions, it's, who aren't you speaking with, and what are ways with folks you're already engaged with that you can help them see the bigger picture and the ecology of what you're doing and the vision of that differently. Yeah. These are great reflections and opportunities. Yeah, Linda, that's great. I think the beauty of a network is not only in creating a sense of connection and collaboration and support, but it's the broadcast and translate mindset, is that you have more awareness of the role that you play in the network, and how that role might need to shift in order to create the kinds of change that you want to see individually and collectively in the world. And I think, Sarah, that gets exactly to your point around the buy-in from the individual parts of the network. This question around network value and value proposition is one that we wrestle with all the time. So again, it's not an easy answer, but it's something we want to explore more in Spokane and in our follow-up webinars to really frame, what's the language that we use around vision, and then how are we very concrete around what roles we're asking people to play and how we're asking them to participate, because I think that can be unclear. I think there are a lot of buzzwords that always circulate around, and network is sometimes largely misunderstood. We think about it as networking and people connecting with each other, and sharing information, and that's part of it. But there is really more of a function where we're understanding it as sort of this ongoing and transformative set of relationships that can help achieve a different kind of vision that we have for the world and a systemic change that takes place as a part of that. Ari, any reflections or any other questions that these are really great just comments and questions that folks are raising based on these questions we're posing here.
I guess we could go to the next, because I feel like it's kind of leading into this broader vision and purpose around the conversation with value. So our next questions are around like shared vision and purpose, and like how do you all see the purpose of the current network, and like if we worked in different ways, like if we all like were starlings for one day, how might that shift the network and unlock some of the transformative aspects like emergence, for example, right? The different and the evolving shape that the starlings move in, or like thinking about fish again, how they move in response to threats in the ecosystem. And then like just also holding the question of like what is common about our visions of this work, and then what are the differences, and thinking a little bit like why might these differences be coming up, and how can we hold those differences without trying to sort of resolve them into a consensus.
So you can enter kind of your reflections on this again into the chat box so that everybody can see and we can reflect on them a bit. And our assumption is that you're here not only because you want to strengthen your own networks in the regions where you're working and very, very specifically there, but of course, what's possible on a broader level in terms of this network. And so when we say the current network, we're really talking about NAAEE, but I think it's translatable and scalable in a variety of ways. And thanks for the reminder, Katie. If you're writing, just make sure that blue panel in the box is selected to panelists and attendees so everybody sees it. So any reflections on how you see the purpose of the current network and what might be possible? I like the being starlings for a day vision. And we'll build, this is to wrap up our time together this time, but it's really to build into what the opportunities are for our ongoing discussion about this.
Plus, I think I should maybe share an example of sort of this, maybe not just Starling for a day, but there's another network that I'm working with that is mixed with very mainstream, like well-funded, predominantly white and privileged people working on the issue. And then there's also a lot of smaller, grassroots, not well-funded groups. And those mainstream groups decided to literally taking on this caterpillar to butterfly transition. And so they formed a group called Liquify, where they're going to be really explicit about the values that hold them together and that guide their work, but try and let go of a lot of the other ways that they're working together. So they're trying to take on this transformational metaphor, and they're in the process of it. And so I guess that's just one example of like a way we can use these metaphors to sort of emulate, the higher transformational aspects that we don't necessarily know what would emerge on the other end, but can try and start taking on the practices of saying, like, what are we willing to let go of to be something that's very different?
Great, thanks for that example, Ari. So any reflections folks have on what might be possible, or what your kind of either the way that you see the network currently or your vision for the network moving forward? Yeah, thanks, Kiki. Great, thanks, Ashley. Great, Sarah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely, Eileen, thanks. Yeah. So what I'm seeing in the few comments that have come in on this so far, and I'd encourage, we really want to see comments from other folks, is, purpose and the possibility. And so it feels like there's the clear need around people feeling supported, which is actually an amazing function of a network. And then there are these kind of bigger picture visions around whatever the structure looks like. I mean, Ashley, this is to your point of, how do we sort of strengthen partnerships at a variety of different levels and actually look to sort of this sense of building a common agenda. And I think that is an amazing sort of opening conversation. And I think, there are opportunities there to build on what you're already doing. To Sarah's point, it's like this amazing network exists. And I think part of the question that Ari and I have for you, and that we're excited to discuss moving forward, is so how is it, what's working and how do we build on that? And then what are possibilities for seeing this differently, and how are ways that we're working, and this is to Linda's point made earlier in our conversation, It's like, how do we do this and have it feel supportive and not draining? I think time consuming was the framing that was used. And I think it might initially be time consuming, but and this gets back to the value question, is how do we then get more intentional about the way in which we're coordinated, whatever that looks like. And we're going to talk about structure and leadership moving forward. And Sarah A., thanks for your point as well. This is a huge issue that I know EE Field is grappling with, and that Ari and I navigate and grapple with quite a bit in terms of who's being engaged, who's involved, who are the folks who are, teaching and leading in the field, who are where are the communities that are being involved or not involved, and why? Yeah. Great, thanks, Katie. Okay. Any other reflections folks want to share, or questions that are coming up? And we'll use the chat and our conversation from this time to guide how we structure the session in Spokane and our conversations moving forward. Great. So I think, Ari, maybe we'll just close up and sort of preview where we're going, and if there are more comments or questions that folks have, you can put those in the chat. We're also happy to hear sort of any reflections people share. I'm not actually sure of what NAAW's practice is. We tend to send out a little survey following any webinars or conversations that we do, but we also like to include that in real time in case that you don't get to the survey, which happens quite a bit because you're all busy in your work and in your lives. So any reflections, again, further ideas of what would be supportive, but also what worked and what didn't work in this session, and then what you'd like to see in future sessions, you can enter that into the chat box. And then these are kind of where we're going from here. Ari, did you want to talk about these and maybe the follow-up resources and other things we could share? Then we can wrap up.
Yeah, I guess. So we're sort of opening really broadly around cultivating a network mindset that includes transformation. Today in Spokane, we'll get more specific around these questions around values and communicating those values. The next online session on October 23rd is moving from a sort of transactional mindset to this transformation. And then finally, we'll talk about specifically around network leadership and how to do that within sort of an ecological mindset. And I did want to, then on the next slide, we have a couple of links, but I wanted to say that I was drawing heavily on Adrienne Marie Brown's book and thinking called Emergent Strategy, where she brings in just a ton of ecological metaphors to think about how we can be working together and being together differently as humans. And then Robin Wall Kimmerer, she's got a PhD, I think, in botany or biology. I think botany. And she's also part of the Potawatomi tribe. So she kind of blends these two very different ways of thinking and applies them to lots of different systems. And she has a couple books, Braiding Sweetgrass, and a recent one on mosses, and a podcast that's a lot quicker to listen to if you'd like. And then a link to that document of the 7 mindsets and practices we shared out.
Great. Any other questions? It looks like Linda signed off and we're close. We're booked for 75 minutes, but it seems like we're wrapping up within the hour. But any other feedback, requests for us, questions to consider as we move forward with this work? Oh, we will send you that resource, and it's also linked in the. You'll get it in the slide deck, and then Ari just shared the link in the chat. There you go. Immediate gratification is fun sometimes. Any other questions for right now, or feedback for us? Great. Well, thanks. And Sarah, I don't know if you wanted to close this out, but just we wanted to thank all of you for being here, and we're looking forward to future sessions with all of you.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Ari and Odin, for this first session, and we'll look forward to seeing hopefully everyone on October 10th in Spokane to continue this conversation.